Some families carry legacies of wealth, honor, and pride. Others carry scars, buried secrets that cling to their bloodline for generations. And then there are families like the Fenridges, whose very name is whispered in half-forgotten tales, etched in the yellowed pages of old town records, and carried like a curse across centuries. Behind their manor's rotting walls lies a story not of fortune, but of death, betrayal, and darkness that refused to die with them. The origins of the Fenridge family stretch back into the early 1700s, a time when power and wealth were often measured not by virtue but by land, trade, and the shadows one could command in society. The Fenridges were not born into greatness, nor were they noble by blood, yet they possessed an uncanny ability to rise quickly in a world that often sought to crush ambition from those not of established lineage. They were traders at first, merchants who dealt in goods that moved silently across borders, not all of them entirely legal. In whispers, people claimed that their early fortune was built upon smuggling, trafficking in relics that should never have left their places of rest, artifacts from forgotten churches and desecrated graves, objects that carried with them curses as much as they did value. Yet outwardly, the Fenridges maintained an image of respectability, wearing the polished masks of genteel society, and this veneer made them untouchable, envied and feared in equal measure. The patriarch who cemented the family's rise was Elias Fenridge, a man described in old records as tall, severe, and unyielding. His business acumen was ruthless, his methods colder still. He married into money, but grew his fortune beyond what his wife's dowry provided, investing in ventures others considered doomed or too dangerous to attempt. Some said he had uncanny foresight, predicting market turns and harvests with unnatural precision. Others murmured that he did not predict but ensured outcomes, whispering that behind the scenes he bent people's wills through threats, bribes, or darker means not easily spoken aloud. Elias built the Fenridge estate stone by stone, overseeing construction with an obsession that unnerved even the sturdiest of masons. The manor was less a home and more a monument, a sprawling fortress with gables that clawed at the sky, narrow windows that resembled watchful eyes, and hallways designed in ways that made no architectural sense, as if the house itself was meant to confuse, trap, and consume. With Elias came the legend of the Fenridge curse, though at first it was no more than rumor. A stable hand died mysteriously during the early years of the estate's construction, found at dawn, with eyes wide open, mouth twisted in terror, no wound upon him and no clear cause of death. A mason fell from scaffolding, though he had been witnessed working on solid ground only minutes earlier, and a child from the village, curious enough to wander too close to the unfinished estate, was never seen again. All these things, the locals insisted, were no accidents, but Elias dismissed them as misfortune, accidents born of carelessness or coincidence. Yet the pattern would continue, echoing across the years of the Fenridge legacy, the family's prosperity rising alongside an unseen tally of tragedy and loss. Elias and his descendants established themselves as landowners of vast influence, their holdings stretching across towns and villages that came to depend upon them. Yet despite their wealth, they were never beloved. The Fenridges inspired awe, yes, but awe laced with unease, as if people sensed that something unnatural was interwoven into their bloodline. They funded churches but never worshipped, they donated to town festivals but never attended, and when they did appear in public, it was always as though they stood apart, observing rather than belonging. Their eyes, villagers would say, were too cold, too calculating, eyes that seemed to weigh and measure everything they saw, as though searching for weakness or value. The generations that followed Elias did not stray far from his path. His sons expanded the family fortune, acquiring mills, shipping contracts, and farmland, often in ruthless deals that left rivals ruined or broken. There were persistent rumors that debts owed to the Fenridges were collected not only in coin but in lives, with families who failed to pay finding themselves mysteriously afflicted with illness, crop blight, or sudden tragedy. One chronicler of the time wrote of the Fenridges as if they had the ear of misfortune, able to call down ruin on anyone who opposed them. Whether this was mere superstition, or whether the Fenridges themselves had delved into forbidden practices to ensure their dominance, remained a question no one dared ask openly. Among the records that survive, one curious pattern stands out: the Fenridges' uncanny connection to objects of antiquity. Inventories list collections of ancient tomes, obscure relics, and items stolen from monasteries, abbeys, and burial sites. These were not the curiosities of idle collectors, but objects that seemed to serve some deeper purpose. There are accounts of strange gatherings at the estate, private dinners that went long into the night, where guests, always wealthy, always influential, left pale and shaken, refusing to ever speak of what they had seen or heard. Servants told of rooms locked for decades, rooms filled with things that no one dared move, objects humming with an energy that unsettled even the bravest among them. It was in these early generations that the roots of the Fenridge legend sank deep into the soil of history. The family's fortune grew, their influence spread, and yet the whispers never ceased. Every misstep, every accident, every untimely death in the surrounding villages seemed to point back to the Fenridge estate. The family name was etched not only in ledgers of wealth, but in the whispered prayers of those who feared them, in the hurried blessings made when one passed the gates of the manor, in the stories parents told their children to keep them away from the shadows of that house. Thus, the origins of the Fenridge family are not remembered as a simple tale of ambition and success, but as a chilling foundation for all that would follow. Their rise was not gilded with honor, but stained with rumor, fear, and tragedy, and the house they built became more than a dwelling. It became the very heart of the darkness that would one day consume them. The Fenridge Manor stood as the most visible testament to the family's power, wealth, and secrecy. Rising above the countryside, its looming structure commanded both admiration and dread from anyone who looked upon it. The first impression of grandeur often gave way to an uneasiness that lingered long after one had turned away from its gates. The manor was not designed like the elegant country estates of the same era, built to charm visitors with symmetry and comfort. Instead, it appeared as though each wing and corridor had been added with an intention beyond beauty, a purpose hidden within its strange and labyrinthine architecture. Local builders and masons who worked on its construction recorded odd instructions from Elias Fenridge himself, who supervised every detail with an almost obsessive fixation. Rooms were ordered to be built with no windows, staircases led to empty walls, and entire sections of the manor seemed to exist without reason, as though built to accommodate something other than human habitation. Stories spread quickly about the manor during its construction, and by the time it was complete, it was already steeped in fear. Travelers passing along the road after sundown swore they saw lanterns moving in the upper windows when the family was away, and workers who stayed too late on the grounds often refused to return, muttering about whispers that carried through the stone corridors long before the house was even finished. The estate grounds were just as unsettling as the house itself. The gardens, while vast and carefully tended, were planted in odd, twisting designs that resembled symbols when viewed from the upper windows. The trees along the property line were planted so close together that they formed what villagers called the Black Wall, a dense barrier that seemed designed to keep eyes from seeing in, or perhaps to keep something from slipping out. Inside, the manor was a maze of opulence and shadow. The grand entry hall, with its towering ceilings and vast staircase, displayed the Fenridge wealth in lavish portraits, imported carpets, and chandeliers that glittered like stars. But beneath the splendor, there was always something off. Visitors described feeling watched as soon as they entered, their footsteps echoing too loudly, as though the walls themselves were listening. Servants often reported doors locking on their own, rooms that grew cold without explanation, and mirrors that seemed to ripple when no one was touching them. The Fenridges never acknowledged these things publicly, but their behaviors suggested they were aware. Entire wings of the manor would be closed off for years at a time, servants rotated frequently, and guests were seldom allowed to wander freely. One of the most infamous aspects of the manor were its hidden rooms and underground passages. Several accounts from those who worked there spoke of narrow staircases that descended deep beneath the earth into chambers where no light could reach. Some were believed to be wine cellars, others storage vaults, yet there were persistent rumors of rooms designed for rituals, spaces lined with chalk markings, filled with strange objects, and lit with black candles. After the family's decline, when looters and curious townsfolk ventured into the abandoned house, stories emerged of finding chains bolted to walls in underground chambers, symbols carved into stone floors, and rooms that seemed designed for gatherings of a nature too disturbing to speak aloud. Though few dared to admit it openly, many believed these hidden spaces were where the family communed with forces not meant for mortal men, trading prayers and sacrifices for the power that kept their fortunes secure. The manor's halls were not only haunted by rumors but by tragedies tied directly to its walls. Family members were found dead within its chambers under mysterious circumstances, some poisoned, some drowned in shallow basins, others with no visible wound, yet eyes filled with terror. Servants disappeared without trace, their names scratched from records, and when asked about them, the Fenridges always claimed they had been dismissed or had left on their own. But villagers whispered of screams that echoed on stormy nights from deep within the estate, of figures glimpsed in windows that should have been empty, of shadows moving against the grain of light. Despite all of this, the Fenridge Manor remained a symbol of dominance. Those invited to its halls attended dinners dripping with wealth, where every course was prepared with imported delicacies, and every wall displayed trophies of travels and acquisitions. Yet even among the privileged, few spoke warmly of their time within its walls. They described meals taken in silence, Elias or his descendants watching their guests as though studying them, their smiles never reaching their eyes. They told of music played in the drawing rooms that seemed slightly off-key, lingering in the mind long after the final note, and of corridors that twisted in such ways that guests often lost their way returning from the washrooms. The manor was not a place of comfort, but of performance, a stage where the Fenridges showcased their wealth while concealing their darker pursuits just beyond the eyes of polite society. Over time, the estate became inseparable from the family's reputation. To speak of the Fenridges was to conjure the image of the manor, its looming silhouette against the horizon, its windows like black eyes watching the countryside. When the family's decline came, the house reflected their downfall. Paint peeled, windows shattered, and the grounds became overgrown. Yet even in ruin, it carried an aura of menace. Some swore the house groaned and shifted in the night as if it were alive, mourning the absence of its masters or hungering for their return. Children dared one another to approach the gates, and those who did often claimed to hear whispers or see faint glimmers of light deep within its broken walls. The Fenridge Manor was more than a dwelling. It was a mirror of the family itself, grand yet corrupted, beautiful yet suffocating, alive with secrets that refused to remain buried. Every stone seemed to bear witness to the acts committed within, every corridor a pathway to stories never meant to be told. And as the years passed, the house became the most enduring reminder of the family's dark legacy. The history of the Fenridge family cannot be told without recounting the endless string of mysterious deaths and curses that clung to their bloodline like a shadow. From the earliest records to the very end of their legacy, tragedy seemed to follow them with unrelenting precision, striking in ways that defied explanation and fed the belief that the family was bound by some unholy pact. What made these deaths so disturbing was not only their frequency but their unnatural nature. They were not the kind of misfortunes one might expect from illness or war or simple chance. They bore signs of something deeper, something that seemed to reach for each member of the family no matter how carefully they tried to escape. The first notable death was that of Elias Fenridge's eldest son, Thomas, a man in his prime and groomed to inherit the estate. In 1739, he was discovered in his bedchamber, his body rigid and cold, though he had been seen in full health only hours earlier. The physician summoned to examine him declared the death unexplainable, remarking only that Thomas's eyes had frozen in terror and his lips were twisted in a silent scream. There were no wounds, no sign of poison, and no indication of illness. Villagers whispered that Thomas had been taken by the very house he was meant to rule, consumed by whatever forces lingered in its walls. His funeral was a lavish affair, yet those who attended noted the uneasy silence that hung over the family, as if they already knew this was but the first of many such tragedies to come. The curse, as the locals came to call it, did not stop with Thomas. Within a decade, his sister Margaret perished under equally strange circumstances. She was found floating in a shallow garden fountain, her face serene, her hands folded neatly upon her chest as though placed there by unseen hands. No one could explain how she had drowned in water so shallow a child could stand in it. Servants whispered that Margaret had been heard speaking to herself for weeks prior, holding conversations in empty rooms and murmuring to shadows that no one else could see. Some claimed she had confided to a maid that she was being followed through the halls by something she dared not name, something that wanted her soul. As generations passed, the pattern only grew darker. Children of the Fenridge line often died young, taken by fevers that no doctor could cure, fevers that came without warning, and left their small bodies cold within days. Adults were plagued by sudden collapses, violent fits, or accidents too improbable to be accidents at all. One cousin was crushed beneath a falling beam in a hallway where no work had been done for years. Another was found hanging from a rope in the library, though there was no ladder or furniture near enough for him to have tied it himself. Servants came to believe the manor itself chose who would live and who would die, that the walls shifted and the air thickened with malice when another Fenridge's time had come. The townspeople who lived in the shadow of the estate believed that these deaths were not random, but retribution, punishments for sins committed by the family in secret. They whispered that the Fenridges had traded their souls for wealth and influence, and that each death was a payment extracted by the forces they had once called upon. They pointed to the fact that the deaths were not only frequent, but grotesquely symbolic. A child drowned in a basin, echoing Margaret's fate. A patriarch suffocated in his sleep, as though smothered by unseen hands. A young bride found on the eve of her wedding with her throat bruised, but no signs of struggle, as though the very air had conspired against her. Each death deepened the conviction that the family was cursed, bound to a fate that would unravel them piece by piece. Even those outside the family were not immune. Servants, maids, and guests who lingered too long at the manor often met their ends in equally baffling ways. One maid was found at the base of the grand staircase, her neck broken, though no one heard her fall. Another vanished entirely, her name scratched out of records, her belongings abandoned in her quarters as though she had never existed. Guests who dared to stay overnight often complained of waking to find deep scratches along their arms or the sensation of being pressed down into their beds by invisible weight. Some fled the estate in the middle of the night and refused ever to return, swearing that to remain longer would mean death. The Fenridges themselves seemed both resigned to and defiant of this reputation. Some family members scoffed at talk of curses, insisting their tragedies were no more than misfortune magnified by gossip. Yet others seemed to embrace the darkness that stalked them, hosting lavish gatherings in the midst of mourning, as though death itself was just another guest at their table. Certain diaries that have survived reveal chilling admissions, references to the price paid, to the shadow's claim, and to the blood that binds. Whether these were poetic laments or confessions of something darker, no one can say for sure, but they stand as grim evidence that at least some Fenridges believed the horrors that consumed their kin were not accidents at all. By the 1800s, the legend of the curse had grown so deeply entwined with the family's name that it was impossible to speak of one without the other. Parents warned their children never to wander near the manor, telling them that the Fenridge curse could reach beyond its walls and claim any soul foolish enough to cross its gates. Priests refused to bless the estate, claiming the land itself rejected holiness. Travelers who passed through the region wrote in journals about the unsettling air that hung over the estate, a heaviness that pressed upon the chest and whispered of mortality. Each new death added another layer to the story, another reason to believe that the Fenridges were doomed by something more than chance. What makes these accounts endure is not only the sheer number of deaths, but the way they seem to mirror one another, echoing through generations as if choreographed by unseen hands. It was not one tragedy that defined the family, but the relentless cycle of them, the repetition of horror that seemed to remind the world that the Fenridges could never escape the shadow that clung to their bloodline. Every ledger, every journal, every local tale written about them bears the mark of this darkness, and each retelling reinforces the belief that the Fenridge family was never meant to live untouched by death. Among the many stories that surrounded the Fenridge name, none were more persistent and unsettling than the whispers of their involvement with the occult. Unlike simple rumors of misfortune or tragedy, these tales carried a weight that seemed to grow with each retelling, as if the very act of speaking about the Fenridges drew shadows closer. From the earliest records of their rise, there were signs that the family had dealings far beyond the natural, that their wealth and power were not simply won through trade and cunning, but through bargains made with forces few dared to name. Their obsession with strange relics and forbidden texts was widely noted, for their estate held collections unlike any other in the region. Inventories catalogued during estate disputes list not only gold and land, but obscure manuscripts written in languages forgotten by most of Europe, charms carved from bone, and icons taken from monasteries long since abandoned. Servants spoke of deliveries made under cover of darkness, crates brought in from distant lands, never opened in public but carried straight into the locked rooms of the manor, where only the Fenridges themselves were allowed entry. One of the most enduring tales concerns Elias Fenridge himself, who was said to have been seen on moonless nights walking the gardens with a lantern, muttering words that did not belong to any known tongue. Farmhands who spied on him claimed he carried objects in his hands, small, strange figures carved in unfamiliar shapes, and placed them at the base of trees planted in unnatural formations. By morning, the figures were gone, and the soil where they had been set would appear blackened, as though scorched by fire, though no flames had been seen. His descendants were rumored to have continued these practices, sometimes vanishing for nights at a time, returning pale, hollow-eyed, and strangely invigorated. Their neighbors, too polite or too fearful to confront them, whispered instead that the Fenridges were not merely practicing superstitions, but performing rituals meant to bind powers to their will. The manor itself became a stage for these rumors. Accounts from those few who attended gatherings there describe rooms illuminated not by warm firelight, but by dim, unnatural glows, candles made of substances that did not burn like wax and filled the air with acrid smoke. Music would be played, not the familiar melodies of the age, but slow, discordant notes that left listeners feeling unwell. Servants told of guests being escorted into hidden chambers, doors closing firmly behind them, and when they emerged hours later, their faces were pale and their voices hushed, as though they had witnessed something they could not speak of. Some of these guests would leave the estate altogether within weeks, abandoning business ventures and selling off property as if shaken by some unseen threat. The town's clergy attempted more than once to intervene, though their efforts were met with strange resistance. Priests who visited the manor for blessings often fell ill shortly after, struck with fevers that left them bedridden for weeks. One priest, Father Ambrose, wrote in his final journal entries that when he entered the Fenridge chapel, a private sanctuary within the estate, he felt a force pushing against him, like invisible hands pressing on his chest, driving him back. He noted strange markings carved into the pews, symbols he could not decipher but which filled him with dread. Within a fortnight he was dead, his body found slumped at his writing desk with a look of horror frozen on his face. After this, few men of faith dared set foot inside the estate again. The family's library was said to be the heart of their occult pursuits. While many great families prided themselves on collections of literature, philosophy, and history, the Fenridge Library was infamous for its locked shelves and guarded tomes. Servants tasked with cleaning the room told of books that hummed faintly when touched, pages that seemed to writhe as if alive, and ink that glistened wet even after centuries. One account described a heavy tome bound not in leather, but in something disturbingly close to human skin, its words written in a script that twisted and shifted before the eyes of those who tried to read it. Stories claimed that the Fenridges read from these books late into the night, their voices carrying through the stone corridors in a rhythm too precise to be mere reading, as if they were chanting incantations in some long-forgotten ritual. The rumors of sacrifices were perhaps the most chilling of all. Missing servants, unexplained livestock deaths, and even the disappearance of children in nearby villages were tied to the family's practices. Although no proof was ever brought forward, too many coincidences occurred for comfort. Villagers would recall animals found mutilated near the estate's edge, their bodies arranged in patterns that resembled the same strange symbols etched into the manor's floors. Some said the Fenridges offered blood not for the sake of cruelty, but to ensure their continued power, that every fortune gained and every rival ruined was the result of pacts sealed with offerings. The more superstitious villagers avoided the estate entirely during new moons, claiming that faint cries could be heard drifting across the fields, carried on winds that stank of iron and smoke. Even as the family's fortune began to decline, the whispers of their occult ties did not fade but seemed to grow louder. People said the Fenridges turned more desperately to their rituals as their influence waned, attempting to bargain for more time, more wealth, more control. Their gatherings became fewer but darker, the glow of strange fires visible through broken windows, chants echoing faintly across the countryside at hours when no one else was awake. Some claim to have seen cloaked figures entering the estate, men and women not of the family but drawn from distant places, arriving only to vanish again with no trace. The manor's walls seemed to hold these secrets tightly, but the evidence lay in the fear etched into the faces of those who lived in its shadow. A fear that did not come from gossip alone, but from something they had seen, heard, or felt when the night grew too still. The occult became inseparable from the Fenridge name, a stain that clung even as their numbers dwindled and their estate fell into ruin. For every unexplained death, every disappearance, and every unnatural occurrence tied to their history, people turned to the belief that the family's dealings with forbidden forces had left them cursed, bound to a fate as dark as the rituals they were said to practice. Whether the whispers held truth or were born of fear, they shaped the legend of the Fenridges into something more than human corruption and tragedy. They became a family seen as standing with one foot in the world of men and the other in realms that were never meant to be touched. By the late 1800s, the once mighty Fenridge family had dwindled into little more than a name, their legacy scattered among ruins, fading ledgers, and half-whispered tales that refused to die. What had begun as a dynasty of wealth and dominance decayed into a haunting story of loss, decline, and vanishing echoes, as though the family was being erased by the same forces that had once elevated them. Their lands, once vast and prosperous, fell into neglect. Fields that had been carefully tilled grew wild with weeds, and crops that once filled markets rotted in the soil. Tenants abandoned their farms, claiming the earth itself had soured, that nothing rooted in Fenridge soil would grow without first withering, as if drained by unseen hands. The once bustling villages tied to their estate became shadows of themselves, their people moving away, their homes left to crumble, all unwilling to live in the shadow of a family whose very name was considered a curse. Inside the manor, the family itself was unraveling. The later generations seemed plagued not only by the mysterious deaths that had always stalked their line, but also by madness, despair, and ruin. Diaries recovered from the estate speak of isolation, of family members who refused to leave their rooms for weeks at a time, who claimed to hear voices whispering from the walls, urging them to acts they dared not write in detail. One such entry, penned by a young Fenridge daughter, described the sensation of being watched constantly, of seeing her reflection move out of step with her actions, of feeling a cold hand upon her shoulder when no one stood behind her. These writings, preserved in brittle ink, are perhaps the only surviving testimony of what life inside the manor was truly like in its final years. The decline of their fortune seemed almost supernatural in its speed. Investments failed, ships sank before reaching port, mills burned without explanation, and debts mounted faster than they could be paid. Families once eager to ally themselves with the Fenridges withdrew, unwilling to risk their own reputations by association. One by one, the allies they had accumulated over generations disappeared, leaving the Fenridges to face their downfall alone. Local records note lawsuits, unpaid debts, and auctions where the family's treasures were sold off for a fraction of their worth. Yet, even in these auctions, strange stories circulated. Objects purchased from the estate were said to bring misfortune to their new owners. Accidents, sudden illnesses, or unexplained tragedies that followed the artifacts like shadows. Some buyers returned these objects, abandoning them at the gates of the estate, while others destroyed them in fire, desperate to rid themselves of whatever dark presence they carried. As the family collapsed, the manor itself fell into ruin. Roof tiles shattered under storms, ivy climbed over its walls like veins, and entire wings of the house became unsafe to enter. Villagers swore that even in its decay, the manor seemed alive, groaning at night as though shifting in pain, its broken windows flickering with lights no one dared investigate. Children would dare one another to approach the gates, though few made it far before fleeing in terror, claiming they had heard footsteps behind them or seen shadows darting across the overgrown gardens. For the townspeople, the ruin of the Fenridge estate was both a relief and a lingering wound, for though the family was gone, the land itself felt tainted, unwilling to shed the darkness that had taken root there. By the turn of the century, the last surviving Fenridge heirs were little more than recluses, too fragile to hold on to what remained of their fortune. Some vanished without record, leaving behind only abandoned rooms and unfinished letters. Others were found lifeless within the estate, their deaths echoing the strange patterns of those who had gone before them, eyes wide with terror, bodies arranged in positions that suggested something unseen had claimed them. With no one left to inherit, the estate was eventually abandoned completely, its doors locked, its windows boarded, and its history left to decay along with its walls. Yet even in abandonment, it never found peace. Travelers continued to report strange sights, lights flickering in empty halls, voices carried on the wind, and the sound of weeping that drifted from its broken towers on stormy nights. What remained of the Fenridge legacy existed only in rumor, in the yellowed newspaper clippings that recorded their scandals and tragedies, and in the stories passed down by those who had lived in their shadow. Their name was invoked as a warning, a symbol of pride turned to rot, of ambition devoured by darkness. Some saw them as victims of a curse, others as sinners punished for bargains with unholy forces, but all agreed that the Fenridge name was not one to be spoken lightly. Even as the 20th century dawned and the world moved forward, the manor stood as a decaying monument to their memory, a place avoided by travelers and feared by locals, its windows staring out like empty sockets across a land that seemed to remember every crime, every tragedy, and every whispered secret. Though the family itself had vanished, their story did not die with them. Ghost tales became attached to their name, spoken around firesides and written into local histories. The ruins of the manor became a place of pilgrimage for the curious and the brave who came seeking evidence of the curse that had consumed the family. Some returned with tales of shadows moving against the light, of whispers that seemed to call their names, of cold hands brushing against their skin in the dead of night. Others never returned at all, vanishing into the same silence that had claimed the Fenridges themselves. Each disappearance, each new story, breathed life back into the legend, ensuring that though the family's bloodline had ended, the horror of their name would never truly fade. The vanishing legacy of the Fenridge family became less a matter of history and more a matter of myth, a cautionary tale woven into the fabric of the region. Their story lived on not through triumph but through fear, through the chill that swept over those who passed their ruined estate, through the whispered prayers of villagers who still marked the sign of the cross when speaking their name, and through the generations who grew up believing that the land itself carried the weight of the family's sins.